Hello everyone. How are you tonight? I hope you're somewhere comfortable, with a little quiet around you. Tonight, we'll spend some time with several true crime stories, each one unfolding in its own way, but all carrying that same quiet weight that can stay with you long after the story ends. Before we begin, if you'd like, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you enjoy these late night stories, you can like the video and subscribe. For now, just get comfortable. Take a slow breath, let the day settle down a little, and we'll begin. Story 1. In mid-September 2019, the Marion County Sheriff's Office in Florida received a request for a welfare check concerning 32-year-old Casey Jones. The call came from Casey's mother, who had become increasingly concerned because she had not spoken with her daughter for more than a month. Casey's mother explained that the circumstances were unusual. She had last seen Michael Wayne Jones, Casey's husband, when he brought the children to her. Michael was 38 years old and was the father of Casey's two young daughters, 2-year-old Mercalli and 1-year-old Ayana. The children had been left with their grandmother after Casey contacted her approximately a month and a half earlier and asked whether she could keep the girls for a couple of days. The arrangement changed gradually. Casey sent several messages saying that she was sick, and what had initially been expected to last only a short time continued for roughly 2 weeks, until the middle of August. During that period, Casey's mother received messages asking about the children, but something about them seemed unusual. She knew the way her daughter normally communicated, and the messages did not sound like Casey. She began to suspect that Michael might have been the person sending them. There were other details that did not fit the usual pattern. Michael had brought the children to their grandmother without Casey accompanying him, and Casey did not come to collect them when the 2 weeks had passed. The children remained with their grandmother instead. Casey's mother also had other reasons to notice the passage of time. 2 of Casey's sons from a previous marriage, 9-year-old Cameron and 4-year-old Preston, had been staying with their biological father. They returned home around the middle of August. Then September arrived, and on September 12th, Cameron's birthday passed without the customary message from his mother on Facebook. Casey had apparently made a habit of posting about his birthday, so the absence was noticed. By then, the silence surrounding Casey had become difficult to overlook. Her mother told investigators that she had not spoken with Michael herself. His Facebook messages had also been removed after other people began contacting him in an effort to learn where Casey was. The welfare check that followed would begin to establish that the absence of communication was only one part of a much larger sequence of events. Investigators would later encounter indications that something had happened inside the home, including blankets and material described as being partially adhered to the floor by decomposing remains. The smell was described simply as the smell of death. For those examining the scene, the physical evidence provided a different account from the one suggested by the absence of Casey's messages and the unexplained passage of time. The investigation was beginning to move away from the question of where Casey was and toward the circumstances that had led to her disappearance. Michael had been described by one person as someone who was never trusted, although what he might have been capable of was not known at the time. As investigators continued assembling the available information, the welfare check developed into an investigation involving months of deception and multiple crimes, with the evidence gradually establishing events that had remained concealed while Casey's family continued waiting for contact from her. By the time investigators began considering the whereabouts of Casey Jones and her 4 children, the concern had expanded beyond the absence of Casey herself. No one appeared to have seen or heard from the children for several weeks, and Casey's mother told investigators that she did not know where any of them were. A deputy explained that a missing persons bolo would be issued for Casey, her vehicle, and the 4 children. He also made clear that the decision was being taken because of circumstances that appeared suspicious, rather than because investigators already knew what had happened. Casey's mother responded that she did not care whether her daughter remained angry with her. She wanted only to know that Casey and the children were safe. A deputy was then sent to the home Casey shared with Michael in Summerfield, Florida. The residence had already been cleared out. Inside, however, the deputy noticed a dark red stain in one of the west bedrooms. The substance appeared to be blood. Investigators also learned that an eviction process had begun in late August. The timing was relevant because the property had recently been cleaned, and investigators spoke with 2 men who had worked inside the residence. One of the men described the condition of the home as unusually disturbing. He said that after entering the property, He contacted the person responsible for it because something seemed seriously wrong. The reason was the smell. When investigators asked him to describe it, he identified it as the smell of death. The front bedroom, he said, had been the worst. He recalled that the men had remarked that the room smelled like a dead body, although he added that he had never actually known what a dead body smelled like. In one corner, he had seen blankets that appeared to be partly attached to the floor by what he described as rotten flesh and other decomposing material. The condition of the room gave investigators another physical detail to consider as they continued assembling the circumstances surrounding Casey and the children. There was also information that appeared, at least initially, to place the family somewhere else. Michael's former wife, Sarah, told investigators that she believed she had seen the family at a McDonald's on Friday, September 13th, one day before Casey and the children were reported missing. The account would have provided a recent sighting of the family. Later, however, Sarah left investigators a voicemail in which she revised what she had said. She explained that, after thinking about it more carefully, she could no longer recall seeing Casey at the restaurant. She said she could only confirm seeing Michael. Sarah also suggested that Casey's disappearance might have been some kind of stunt, referring to the amount of conflict that she associated with Casey. Investigators checked the McDonald's surveillance footage. The footage did not show the family at the restaurant. Sarah's account, therefore, became another part of the growing record that required clarification. When detectives spoke with her, she explained that she knew only what Michael had told her. According to Sarah, Michael had said that he and Casey had separated. He had described the relationship as something he could no longer tolerate and had spoken to Sarah about the difficulties between himself and Casey. The contact between Michael and Sarah had resumed earlier that summer. On July 11, 2019, Michael sent Sarah a message, re-establishing communication between the two after a period in which they had been somewhat estranged. Over the following weeks, some of his messages became increasingly familiar in tone. One message began with, "Hey beautiful," followed by a question about how she was doing. Another message included the words, "Miss you guys," referring to Sarah and her 4 children. These exchanges formed another part of the chronology investigators were beginning to assemble as they examined Michael's movements, his communications, and the changing accounts surrounding Casey and the children. Sarah did not appear to return the same familiarity in her messages to Michael. When he told her that he missed her and the children, she replied, "Miss you too, friend," keeping the exchange within the boundaries of what she described as a platonic relationship. She later explained that she and Michael had not spoken much before she and her children moved to the area. Their own separation, she said, had not been particularly good. Even so, when Michael began speaking with her again, he offered his own explanation for why their communication had been limited. According to Sarah, Michael described Casey as jealous and said that Casey had prevented him from communicating with Sarah for an extended period. He also characterized Casey as manipulative and dishonest and made negative comments about Casey's mother. After Michael re-established contact with Sarah, he began helping to watch the 3 children they shared while Sarah was at work. At roughly the same time, Cameron, Preston, Mercalli, and Diana were staying for extended periods with relatives. Michael eventually gave Sarah an explanation for why he had left his own residence. He told her that his landlord had informed him that the property on Trailer Street was essentially condemned or improperly set up for habitation, and that no one should be living there. Michael said he had removed his belongings, placed some of them in a storage shed, and then moved to Sarah's home. According to Sarah, Michael had been staying with her for approximately 2 weeks, beginning around the end of August. During that period, however, the whereabouts of Casey and her 4 children remained unexplained. The question became more complicated when detectives returned to Sarah's earlier statement about seeing the Jones family at McDonald's on September 13th. By this point, Sarah acknowledged that the account had not been accurate. She explained that she had panicked after receiving a message from the Marion County Sheriff's Department around 4 o'clock in the morning. She had been asleep and then went to Michael, who was sleeping in one of the boys' rooms, to ask why investigators were trying to contact her. She said Michael did not appear to understand what was happening. Sarah had also received a message from Michael's mother asking how to contact him, and she realized that other people did not know he was staying at her home. The detective continued asking about the McDonald's story. Sarah initially said that she had panicked, but when asked why that would have led her to invent a sighting of Casey and the children, she gave a more direct explanation. She said that, in her mind, she did not want to get into trouble because Michael was staying with her. The detective considered another possibility, that the false sighting had been intended to create the impression that the family had been seen after the date on which investigators believed something might have happened. Sarah was then asked whether Michael had instructed her to say that she had seen him on Friday. She confirmed that he had. When asked why she had not simply told investigators that Michael had asked her to make the statement, the answer became part of the developing account of what had occurred between them. Michael had not merely been staying at Sarah's home. According to Sarah, he had also told her what to say when investigators began asking questions about the missing family. Sarah told the detective that Michael had written down several notes before leaving, including an instruction to say that she had seen him at McDonald's on Friday. He had apparently given her a simple version of the story, that he and Sarah had met at the McDonald's in Palatka that day. Afterward, Sarah said she told Michael that he needed to contact investigators himself. She was becoming increasingly frightened by the situation and believed that law enforcement might begin to suspect him of harming Casey. Her concern was influenced partly by the fact that both she and Michael were familiar with true crime stories and understood how quickly suspicion could fall on a spouse when a person disappeared. Sarah emphasized that Michael was not at her home when she spoke with investigators. Michael had told her that he intended to go to the police department and explain what was happening. Instead, he left a voicemail for one of the detectives. In the message, Michael identified himself and said he had learned that investigators were trying to contact him about his wife. He explained that he was not currently in the area, but expected to return later that evening, or more likely early the following morning. He said he would come to the detective's office and speak with investigators, asking for the location and office details so that he could arrive as early as 9 o'clock. The meeting would not take place as Michael had described. On the evening of September 15th, only one day after Casey and the children were reported missing, Michael crashed his vehicle in Brantley County, Georgia, across the state line from Florida. When local authorities responded to the crash, they noticed a strong and unpleasant odor coming from the vehicle. Michael then told them what was inside. He said that his wife was dead and that her body was in the vehicle, adding that the officers might as well place him in handcuffs. Investigators searched the vehicle and found Casey's body in the location Michael had described. The discovery led to Michael being questioned by investigators with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. During the interrogation, he began describing the events that had preceded Casey's death. According to Michael's account, an argument had taken place inside the trailer. He said Casey had been close to him while he was trying to sleep and had been holding a phone near his face while accusing him of things he said were untrue. The accusations, he explained, included allegations that he had been unfaithful and that he had been making plans involving his former wife. Michael said he eventually moved from the bed to a chair and repeatedly told Casey to leave. He described a recliner inside the trailer and said Casey moved behind it and obtained a baseball bat. Michael claimed that he reached toward the floor and pushed her while she struck and punched him, and that he began swinging at the bat as the confrontation continued. His account provided investigators with his version of the circumstances immediately preceding Casey's death. There was, however, another part of the investigation that remained unresolved. Casey's body had been found. Her 4 children had not. The whereabouts of Cameron, Preston, Mercalli, and Diana remained unknown as investigators continued examining Michael's account and the events that had taken place inside the trailer. Michael confirmed to investigators that the confrontation inside the trailer had caused Casey's death. Afterward, he said he wrapped her body in plastic, placed it inside a plastic storage bin, and kept it in the bedroom of the trailer. When investigators asked where Casey had been killed, Michael answered that it had happened inside the trailer. He also acknowledged trying to clean the scene, including areas of the walls where he said blood had splattered. According to Michael's later account, Casey was killed on July 10, 2019, while the 4 children were asleep inside the home. When the children asked about their mother afterward, Michael told them that he and Casey were taking a break. The explanation allowed the children to continue without being told that their mother had died. The following day, Michael contacted his former wife, Sarah. In a message, he suggested that Casey's absence had been exaggerated. Based on his experience with Casey and her mother, he said he believed the situation had been blown out of proportion. He told Sarah that he did not believe anything had happened to Casey and suggested that she might simply be staying in a hotel somewhere with the 4 children, possibly amused by the concern surrounding her disappearance. In the weeks that followed, people occasionally asked Michael where Casey was. He explained that, at first, her mother would ask about her only from time to time. He also continued bringing the girls to Casey's mother, as he had done previously. Michael said that during this period he had Casey's phone and would sometimes communicate with people while presenting himself as Casey. The arrangement continued while Casey's body remained concealed. Michael later said that he moved the body into the family van and drove around with it intermittently. Sarah would eventually learn what had happened. When she was told that Casey's body had been found, she had to leave work. Her immediate concern was for the children. She later described wondering whether Michael had been driving around with her own sons in the van, while Casey's body was inside. Her deepest concern, she said, had been that Michael might also have harmed the children. That concern would prove to be justified. Less than a month after Casey's death, Michael said that his attention turned toward the 4 children. He described a moment when the children had vomited on the floor and said that he had begun thinking about the approaching school year. The boys were old enough to attend school, and he said that he eventually began strangling them. The interrogation was temporarily paused. Several hours later, Michael returned to the same chair and continued describing what had happened. He told investigators that he killed 9-year-old Cameron in his bedroom. Michael said he was on top of Cameron while the boy was in bed. At some point, he pulled Cameron to the ground and continued holding him until the child stopped moving. Investigators asked whether Cameron had fought back. Michael said that he had kicked during the struggle. When asked how long the attack lasted, Michael described the period as seeming to last a very long time. He told investigators that Cameron had initially been face down. He described using his hands and, at one point, placing his knee against Cameron's chest. Investigators then asked whether 4-year-old Preston had awakened or heard what was happening. Michael said that he had not. Preston had been sleeping only a few feet away while his older brother was killed. After Cameron's death, Michael placed the boy's body inside a suitcase and left it inside the trailer. The following morning, Preston woke and asked where his brother had gone. Michael said that Preston was killed the next night. He told investigators that he had initially used his hands when killing Cameron, and that afterward his hands were hurting. He remembered that he had zip ties in the trailer, and when Preston would not settle down to sleep, Michael took him from the bed and placed a zip tie around his neck. He then brought the 4-year-old into the bathroom. Michael told investigators that he held Preston underwater until the child died. Investigators later informed the boy's biological father of their deaths. Cameron and Preston are believed to have been killed in mid-August. Preston's birthday was August 22nd, meaning he was only days away from turning 5. Michael said that Preston's body remained inside a trash bag in the bathroom for several days. He later placed the boys in separate plastic containers, while Cameron's body remained inside the suitcase. The investigators continued asking Michael about what he had been trying to accomplish during this period. Part of the answer existed in his earlier communications with Sarah. Approximately 1 month before Cameron and Preston were killed, Michael had sent Sarah a message expressing intense hostility toward the 2 boys. He told her that he hated them and hoped Casey would take them soon. Those feelings were not apparent to the boys' biological father during his most recent interaction with Michael. When speaking with investigators, their father recalled that Michael had behaved unusually warmly when the children were picked up from a mall so they could return to Georgia for a 2-week visit. Michael had approached him with an apology. He said that he wanted to apologize for having believed things Casey had said about the children's father, including allegations that he had abused Casey, struck the children, and committed other acts that Michael now said he did not believe were true. The children's father remembered being surprised by the sudden change in Michael's manner. He said Michael behaved as though they were close friends, speaking casually and telling him that he wanted him to spend more time with the children. They shook hands and hugged. The father later described himself as having accepted the apology because he was inclined to forgive people, and at the time he believed that Michael might finally be behaving normally. The significance of that meeting would become clear only afterward. Michael would later tell investigators that, after the deaths of Casey, Cameron, and Preston, he considered turning himself in. At one point, he said, he even sat outside a police department with Mercalli and Ayanna inside the vehicle. The 2 youngest children were still alive. The investigation had not yet reached its final discovery. Michael had considered turning himself in, but instead he drove away from the police department with Mercalli and Ayanna still in the vehicle. The decision was followed by the deaths of the 2 youngest children. Michael told investigators that he had filled the bathtub and placed 2-year-old Mercalli into it. He said he put his hands around her throat and held her face down in the water. He then did the same to the infant, Ayana. The murders occurred shortly before Labor Day weekend at the end of August 2019. When investigators asked whether he had been angry when he made the decision to kill the girls, Michael said that he had reached what he described as a point of no return. After their deaths, Michael placed Mercalli and Ayana together inside a plastic container. He then put the container into the van with the bodies of Cameron and Preston. The 4 children remained with him as he drove toward Georgia. Their bodies were not inside the vehicle when Casey's body was discovered. Michael later told investigators that, after crossing into Georgia on September 15th, he drove to a wooded area and disposed of the children's bodies shortly before the crash. He subsequently led investigators back to the location. All 4 children's bodies were recovered from the area. Investigators also asked Michael why he had disposed of the children's bodies, but had continued carrying Casey's body with him in the van. Michael could not provide an explanation. He said that he did not know. The investigation eventually reached the question of what had driven Michael to kill Casey, and then the children. Detectives asked whether his actions had been motivated by an attempt to avoid imprisonment, by anger toward Casey, or by some combination of the two. Michael said that it had been a little of both. He also described the children as being connected to their mother in his mind. He said that he did not know what to do, and that he could not bring himself to ask anyone for help. The children's deaths were therefore considered alongside the earlier violence against Casey and the circumstances in which the bodies had been concealed. Before Casey's disappearance, there had already been people who distrusted Michael. One person later recalled telling Casey that she did not want her to marry him. She said she knew something was wrong with Michael, although she could not identify exactly why she disliked him. Michael was ultimately charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. According to court transcripts, his defense presented evidence concerning his mental state. His attorneys argued that he had experienced delusions and delirium, citing statements he had made to mental health clinicians after the killings. Michael told clinicians that he had heard Casey's voice after her death. According to his account, the voice urged him to reunite the children with their mother and told him that the family would eventually be resurrected together. The defense used those statements in asking the jury to spare Michael's life and impose life imprisonment without the possibility of parole instead of the death penalty. The argument was unsuccessful. Michael was found guilty on all charges. He received a life sentence for Casey's second-degree murder. For the murders of the 4 children, he received 4 death sentences. In 2023, Michael appealed his first-degree murder convictions and death sentences. The ruling was affirmed in 2025. Michael remains on death row. Story 2. The first indication that something was wrong came shortly before 5 o'clock on the morning of Monday, December 15, 2025, when a 911 call reached the Clovis, New Mexico Police Department. The caller did not identify themselves, and the connection ended before any useful information could be obtained. What remained was a location and the possibility that something was happening inside a suburban home. Officers were sent to the residence, where they approached through the open garage. The house was quiet, and there was no immediate indication of what had prompted the call. At the garage, an officer announced their presence and explained that police had received a report of a possible burglary in progress. Someone inside could be heard, but there was no response to the officer's announcements. A young man eventually appeared. He was 19-year-old Darren Munoz, who explained that he lived at the house with his parents. He had apparently just woken up, and the officer asked whether the front door and garage were normally left open. Darren indicated that they could be, and the officer asked him to wake his parents. There was nothing unusual in Darren's initial account. His parents, he said, were still asleep inside. The officer asked whether anyone else was present in the house, and instructed Darren to bring his parents outside if possible. Darren went inside. A short time later, the situation changed. Officers began communicating with one another about what they were seeing inside the residence. One officer reported that someone appeared to be covered in blood, and an ambulance was requested. The officers moved farther into the house while continuing to assess whether anyone else might still be inside. There were indications of severe injuries. One victim appeared to have suffered what officers described as a possible gunshot wound. Another was found with blood around the nose and a pool of blood nearby. The officers continued clearing the rooms, checking the residence carefully because they could not yet be certain that the person responsible was gone. The house was eventually cleared, and no other person was found inside. Darren was kept outside while officers continued working. He was told not to return to the residence, and was placed in a patrol vehicle for the time being as investigators began determining what had happened. Inside, officers found 2 victims. They were Darren's parents, 71-year-old Dinah Munoz, and her husband, 59-year-old Oscar Munoz, who was also known as Steve. The circumstances surrounding their deaths were not immediately established. At that early stage, officers were working from what was physically present at the scene: an unexplained 911 call, an open garage, a young man who said his parents were asleep, and 2 family members who had been found seriously injured inside the home. The initial question was therefore not only what had happened to Dinah and Oscar, but why someone had called 911 without identifying themselves, and what had taken place in the house before police arrived. The answers would have to be assembled gradually, from the scene itself and from the details that emerged afterward. Both victims appeared to have suffered gunshot wounds to the head. Dinah Munoz was already deceased when officers reached her, while Oscar, known as Steve, remained alive, although his condition was critical. Paramedics treated him at the scene before transporting him for further medical care, with the decision eventually made to fly him to Lubbock, where more specialized treatment was available. As morning arrived, detectives began working through the hours before the shooting. They spoke with people in the surrounding neighborhood, trying to establish when the gunfire might have occurred and whether anyone had noticed anything unusual. One neighbor told investigators that they believed the shooting had taken place at approximately 4:45 in the morning. They had not heard any gunshots themselves, although their German Shepherd had been awake and moving around the property at about that time. Across the street, detectives then spoke with Steve's sister, Angelina, and her husband, Henry. Neither had yet understood what had happened inside the Munoz home. Detective Zach Farley introduced himself and explained that an incident had occurred at the house across the street. He confirmed that the people involved were Angelina's brother and sister-in-law, while making clear that the investigation was still active and that detectives could not yet provide every detail. The presence of the crime scene unit drew Angelina's attention. She asked who the people inside were, and detectives explained that the unit was documenting the residence and collecting photographs and other evidence. Angelina appeared shocked by what she was hearing, having previously encountered violent cases mainly through videos and online reports rather than from across the street from her own home. Detectives asked whether the couple's surveillance cameras had recorded anything during the relevant period. The footage provided one potentially useful detail. Around the estimated time of the shooting, a figure could be seen running away from the Munoz residence. Angelina and Henry were later asked to come to the police station, where investigators could explain more of what had occurred and gather additional information from them. There, detectives told them that the original 911 call had been treated as a report of a murder in progress. When officers arrived, they had found 2 people who had been shot. Steve was still alive and was being flown to Lubbock for medical treatment. When Angelina asked where he had been shot, detectives told her that the wound was to his head. According to the police report, the bullet entered through the right side of Steve's cheek and exited from the left rear portion of his head. Despite the severity of the injury, he had survived the initial shooting and was receiving the level of care investigators believed he required. Dinah had not survived. She had been pronounced deceased at the scene. The questions surrounding the shooting were still largely unanswered. Detectives were trying to establish who had entered the house, who had made the anonymous 911 call, and what had occurred before officers arrived. Angelina and Henry were also asked about Darren. They described him as quiet, helpful, and respectful, and said they had not observed problems between him and his parents. They told detectives that Steve and Dinah had recently spent several days in San Antonio, celebrating their anniversary. Darren had remained at home while they were away, and his parents had returned only the day before the shooting. That information placed Darren inside the house during the period immediately preceding the deaths. By then, Steve was being treated in Lubbock, Dinah was dead, and the investigation had narrowed considerably. Darren remained at the residence, where officers had initially encountered him after the unexplained 911 call. He was taken into an interview room. With the physical evidence still being processed at the house, detectives had very few people available who could describe what had happened from inside the residence. Darren was therefore asked to explain what he knew. An investigator introduced himself and told Darren that detectives were trying to understand the events that had taken place. At that point, Darren was the only person they could question who had been inside the house and remained able to provide an account of what had occurred. Darren was still in the interview room when investigators began asking questions about what might have happened to his parents. He was told that Steve had been taken to the hospital, although detectives could not yet say whether he would survive. The possibility that the shooting had occurred while his parents were asleep was raised during the interview. Darren responded by asking who would want them dead and who would enter a house in the middle of the night. He then began talking about his father and the relationship between the family members, offering details that did not immediately explain the shooting. He described Steve as a generally kind person and mentioned that his father did not like certain biological family connections, although the significance of those comments was not immediately clear. As investigators continued working through the available evidence, they gained access to Diana's phone and reviewed surveillance footage from the residence from the previous night. The footage showed someone entering through the open garage. A few seconds later, investigators heard a distinct mechanical sound from inside the garage, consistent with the slide of a handgun being pulled back. The footage did not clearly establish the person's identity. The figure could be seen entering the residence, but the available image was not sufficient for investigators to determine with certainty who it was. They therefore began speaking with people who knew Darren. One of his friends described him as someone who had never displayed violent behavior in their experience. Within the friend group, Darren was portrayed as the person most likely to avoid a confrontation rather than participate in one. His friend said that, if an argument or fight began, Darren would generally try to distance himself from it, and the idea that he would intentionally hurt someone seemed inconsistent with the person they knew. The friend was then asked when they had last seen Darren. They recalled visiting the house 2 days earlier. Darren had seemed different from his usual self. Normally, they said, he was openly affectionate and greeted people warmly, often offering a hug. On that occasion, however, he had been unusually distant. The friend also remembered that Darren had appeared to be hiding his neck, although they could not say why. They wondered whether he might have been concealing some kind of mark or injury, but they did not know whether there was anything actually there. Investigators also asked about Darren's relationship with a 17-year-old girl named Gabby. The friend said the two had been seeing each other for roughly 2 months, although their relationship had only recently become official. According to the account, that had happened about a week earlier. Investigators then brought Gabby in for questioning. She acknowledged that she had spent part of the weekend with Darren while his parents were away. Their parents, she said, were not aware that the two had been together during that time. There was another detail that drew the investigators' attention. Gabby was wearing a hoodie that appeared similar to the clothing seen on the unidentified person in the surveillance footage. The investigators asked her about the camera recording and told her that the footage showed someone walking near the house at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning. They explained that the person on the recording looked remarkably similar to her. Gabby questioned whether they were suggesting that she had been outside at that hour. The investigators confirmed that they had surveillance footage. At that point, the evidence still did not provide a complete identification, but the footage, the clothing, the timeline, and the accounts given by people close to Darren were beginning to form a more detailed picture of the hours surrounding the shooting. Gabby remained in the interview area while arrangements were made for her mother to come to the station. She continued to insist that she had been at home at 4 o'clock that morning and said she wanted to speak with her mother before answering further questions. While they waited, detectives returned to Darren. Their questions moved gradually through his relationships with his parents and the people around him. Darren said that he had a good relationship with his father. He also spoke about his relationship with Diana, explaining that she had known him since he was very young and had essentially occupied the role of a mother in his life. A short time later, Gabby's mother arrived. Gabby immediately told her what the detectives had been suggesting, including their belief that the person visible in the surveillance footage might have been her. Her mother reacted strongly and initially challenged the investigators, but then turned her attention toward Gabby and urged her to be truthful. She reminded her daughter that lying about where she had been could create additional problems, particularly if investigators later established that her account was inaccurate. She also questioned Gabby about the night she had spent with Darren, because Gabby had previously told her that she had been at his house during the weekend while his parents were away. Gabby maintained that she had left the residence before Darren's parents returned from their trip. She said that she had been home and in bed when the shooting occurred. Her mother supported that account, repeatedly telling investigators that Gabby had been at home. She also made clear that she had no reason to believe her daughter would place herself in greater trouble by concealing where she had been. According to police reports, investigators were later able to compare the account with available phone records, which supported the timeline of communication between Gabby and her mother. Detectives also returned to the question of how Darren could have remained asleep while his parents were shot inside the same house. They asked him what had awakened him that morning. Darren said that nothing had awakened him. He explained that he had not gotten up until an officer was already in the garage. For investigators, the explanation remained difficult to reconcile with the events described at the scene. The shootings had occurred only a short distance away, and the house had been occupied by several people. Still, at that stage, they could not completely exclude the possibility that Darren had genuinely been asleep and had not heard the gunshots. There was, however, another piece of information that investigators had begun to examine more closely: the anonymous 911 call. Detectives had listened to the recording several times while speaking with Darren. During the interview, one investigator told him that the voice on the call sounded like his. The call itself had been brief. The caller reported that someone was inside the house, but did not provide an identity before the connection ended. Detectives asked Darren why someone would report a burglary if there was no burglary. They also questioned him about whether he had a habit of lying. Darren denied that he did. The investigators explained that they would continue checking his statements against the evidence they had collected, and that if something he told them proved inconsistent with that evidence, they would return to the subject. The conversation did not continue for long after that. Once the detectives left the room, Darren invoked his right to an attorney. The interview ended. Investigators were left with several unresolved details, including the identity of the person captured on the surveillance footage and the voice heard on the 911 recording. They returned to Gabby's interview. The surveillance video was brought up again, this time examined more closely. Investigators paused the recording at a point where the person's clothing and footwear could be seen. They asked Gabby to look at the shoes. She acknowledged that they appeared to be hers, but she continued to deny that she had been at the house that night. She said that although the shoes looked like the ones she owned, she had not been there when the shooting occurred. The footage remained only one part of the developing investigation, but the similarities between the person recorded outside the house and the people investigators were questioning were becoming increasingly difficult to separate from the timeline they were trying to establish. The investigators continued examining the surveillance recording with Gabby, paying particular attention to the figure's clothing and appearance. They pointed out that the shoes visible in the footage appeared similar to hers, but they also noticed differences that became more apparent as the image was studied. The person's hair appeared to end at a particular point along the back of the head, suggesting that it might have been covered or styled differently from Gabby's. The investigators also noticed a logo on the shirt. As the figure moved, the logo became visible beneath the hair, making it possible to compare the clothing and physical characteristics more closely. Gabby continued to deny that she was the person shown. When investigators asked her to identify the individual, she said she did not know who it was. The more carefully they examined the footage, the less certain they became that Gabby was the person who had entered the house. That possibility gradually fell away, but another piece of information was beginning to take its place. One of Darren's friends told investigators that Darren was technically capable of making his own firearm. According to the friend, Darren had built what was described as a ghost gun, assembling it piece by piece rather than obtaining a complete firearm through a conventional manufacturer. The term refers to privately made firearms that are assembled by individuals rather than licensed manufacturers and which may lack serial numbers, making them more difficult to trace. Investigators wanted to know whether Darren actually possessed such a weapon and, more importantly, who had access to it around the time of the shooting. They asked Gabby about a Glock chambered in 9mm. She was asked who had the weapon the previous night. Gabby identified Darren and another person in their circle of friends as having had access to it. That other person was 18-year-old Julio Zamora. The investigators then asked when she had last seen Julio with the gun. Gabby said it had been the previous night. She explained that Julio had been sending Snapchat messages, including what appeared to be images or videos involving the firearm. One of the recordings showed what she described as a ghost Glock. The conversation then became more serious. Gabby's mother urged her daughter to provide investigators with everything she knew, emphasizing that the circumstances were no longer simply a matter of protecting friendships. She wanted Gabby to explain what she had seen, what she had heard, and who else might have been involved. Gabby maintained that she had not participated in the shooting. She then provided investigators with another name. When asked who she understood was supposed to carry out the act, she identified Julio. That statement gave detectives a new direction. Until then, the investigation had centered largely on Darren, his parents, the unidentified person seen on the surveillance footage, and the firearm that might have been involved. Gabby's account introduced a second young man, who could potentially be connected to both the weapon and the events surrounding the shooting. Investigators began looking for Julio. He was not immediately easy to locate, but officers eventually found him and made contact. When they approached him, they asked for permission to look inside his vehicle. Julio agreed. The search became another part of the developing record, as detectives began examining whether the information they had received about the firearm and the events at the Munoz residence could be supported by physical evidence. When officers examined Julio's vehicle, they found a firearm inside. They asked whether the weapon was real or merely a toy, and Julio acknowledged that it was a real gun. He was then asked to step out of the vehicle while officers continued their investigation. With the firearm recovered, detectives had a significant piece of physical evidence to compare with the information they had already gathered. Julio was subsequently questioned about his involvement in the shooting. The investigators told him that they had spoken with the young women involved and believed they already understood much of what had happened. They suggested that Julio had been influenced by Darren and warned him against allowing himself to become the person who would ultimately take responsibility for someone else's plan. Julio eventually began describing what he said had happened. According to his account, Darren had been talking about the plan for approximately 2 months. The subject had reportedly come up repeatedly, over and over, until Julio eventually became involved. Looking back, Julio said he believed he should have walked away. He described spending approximately 10 to 15 minutes inside the residence, uncertain about what he was going to do. At one point, he said, he held the firearm against his own head while considering whether to proceed. He was afraid and said that he had initially wanted to leave the house without harming anyone. He described entering the residence and remaining there for several minutes without knowing how to act. Eventually, he said, he considered simply leaving. But he did not. When investigators asked whether he ultimately carried out the shooting, Julio acknowledged that he had. He said he felt guilty afterward and had difficulty explaining why he had gone through with it. Investigators asked specifically about Dinah. Julio said he had become frightened and pulled the trigger once. The act appeared to have been impulsive in the moment, according to his account, rather than something he could easily explain afterward. He was also asked whether the firearm recovered from his vehicle was the same weapon used in the shooting. Julio said that it was. The investigators then returned to the question of who had originated the plan. They wanted Julio to explain what Darren had told him, what Darren expected to happen, and why the shooting had been arranged in the first place. Julio said that Darren had wanted his father dead. He also said Darren had spoken about money, although Julio did not know exactly how much money Darren expected to receive. According to police reports, Darren had told friends that his father owned a chain of local convenience stores. The people around him apparently believed that the businesses would eventually become Darren's inheritance, giving them one possible explanation for why he might have expected to receive money after his father's death. That assumption, however, did not match the actual circumstances. Steve did not own the chain of convenience stores. The belief that Darren would inherit those businesses therefore rested on information that, according to investigators, was not true. At this stage, the financial motive being discussed among the young people involved was based at least partly on Darren's own description of his father's assets, rather than on the actual ownership of the businesses. According to his LinkedIn profile, Oscar Steve Munoz worked as a district supervisor. The information about his employment provided another detail about the man whose death had prompted the investigation, although it did not change the circumstances detectives were trying to establish. Steve's condition remained critical after he was transported to the hospital. He later died from his injuries. During Julio's interview, investigators asked whether there was anything else he believed they needed to know. Julio then added another detail about Darren's involvement. He said Darren had also threatened to kill him if he refused to take part. When investigators asked whether that was why he had been afraid, Julio said that it was. The investigation eventually resulted in criminal charges against both young men. According to court documents, 19-year-old Darren Munoz was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with conspiracy to commit murder and criminal solicitation to commit murder. 18-year-old Julio Zamora was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. Prosecutors are seeking a life sentence for Julio. Both Darren and Julio have entered pleas of not guilty, and the cases remain ongoing. No other person has been charged in connection with the deaths of Dinah Munoz and Oscar Steve Munoz. The investigation had begun with an unidentified 911 call shortly before dawn, followed by officers arriving at a quiet residential home and finding 2 members of the same family with gunshot wounds. Over the following hours, detectives assembled information from the house, surveillance footage, phone records, interviews, and the statements of people within Darren's circle. The resulting case remains before the courts, where the allegations against Darren Munoz and Julio Zamora have yet to reach a final legal determination. Story 3. By August 18, 2024, investigators in Smithfield, Rhode Island, were speaking with an 80-year-old woman who had been taken to a local hospital after reporting that she had been abducted from her home. The woman, identified in the investigation as Doris, though that name was changed to protect her identity, described an encounter that had begun while she was putting away groceries. There had been a knock at the door. A man she had never seen before was standing outside. He told her he wanted her money, her jewelry, and the keys to her car. Doris told him she did not know him and would not let him inside. According to her account, the man then pushed his way through the door. Later, while speaking with investigators, she wondered whether she should have run toward another woman who was nearby and gone out onto the porch. The officer listening to her told her that she had done nothing wrong. Her account was difficult to reconcile with the scene investigators had found at her home in Coventry. The house was orderly. There were no obvious signs of a prolonged struggle, and the only details that seemed out of place were several grocery bags left scattered around the property. Nothing about the interior immediately suggested that an elderly woman had been forcibly removed. There was another detail that required explanation. Doris was now in a hospital in Smithfield, approximately 20 miles from her home. Investigators learned that her daughter lived in Smithfield, and that Doris regularly traveled there to visit her grandchildren. At first, that information seemed to provide a possible explanation for why she had been found in the area. But Doris had given investigators a different account of how she arrived there. She said that she had been getting out of her car in the driveway when someone approached her, attacked her, and forced her into the trunk of her own vehicle. The man then drove away with her. That meant there should have been something recorded. Across the street from the property was a building equipped with security cameras, and investigators began trying to determine whether the footage had captured anything connected to Doris's account. A woman familiar with the building contacted its owner, who agreed to meet with the officers and review the recordings. The investigators were looking for something relatively simple. They wanted to see Doris arrive, get out of her car, and determine what happened afterward. The possibility that an 80-year-old woman had been abducted in broad daylight from her own driveway was difficult to establish from the condition of the house alone. The cameras offered a way to place her movements in sequence. When the building's owner arrived, he brought the investigators into a back office and accessed footage from the previous evening, the period Doris had identified as the time of the alleged abduction. At approximately 8 o'clock, Doris's black Buick Encore could be seen reversing into the driveway. The vehicle stopped. Doris appeared to continue with the ordinary task she had described, making several trips between the car and the house while carrying groceries inside. Nothing unusual was immediately visible. There was no obvious confrontation in the driveway, and no stranger could be seen approaching her vehicle at that point. For investigators, however, the footage did not necessarily settle the matter. They continued watching. The movements recorded by the camera were quiet and ordinary, which meant that the significance of what came next depended on details that were not immediately apparent from the first moments of the recording. Doris had entered the evening believing she was returning home with groceries. By the time investigators began reconstructing the events surrounding that arrival, she was in a hospital 20 miles away, describing an assault, an abduction, and a journey she said had begun inside the trunk of her own car. The house itself had offered very little evidence. The camera was beginning to provide more. The first review of the footage did not seem to support Doris's account. She could be seen arriving at her home, but there was no obvious moment when another person approached her car and forced her inside. One investigator considered the possibility that something might have happened during the few seconds that followed, although the footage did not appear to show it. Then they noticed the green Chevrolet Impala. Approximately 3 minutes after Doris arrived, the vehicle passed her house and soon came to a stop across the street. The investigators continued watching as Doris moved between her car and the house, carrying her groceries inside. At the same time, the driver of the Impala remained nearby. As the footage was advanced, the investigators noticed something that changed their understanding of the scene. The person who eventually entered Doris's car did not appear to be Doris. They rewound the recording and watched it again. This time, they could see another person leaving the area around the house. The individual walked along the street, approached a neighboring driveway, and then moved behind a tree before entering Doris's backyard. The person remained there for a period of time. Eventually, he approached the front door and rang the doorbell. No one answered. He then moved around toward the back of the house. From her hospital bed, Doris would later explain what happened after she finally responded to the man. She had told him that she did not know him and that he was not coming inside. The camera outside the house could not show what was happening indoors, and from the street, there was little indication that anything unusual was taking place. Cars continued passing by. The surrounding homes remained quiet. Inside Doris's house, according to her account, the man forced her to collect her jewelry. After looking through what she had, he apparently decided that the items were not worth taking and left them behind. He did, however, take her car keys. The surveillance footage then showed him moving toward Doris's Buick Encore. He opened the trunk and began repositioning the vehicle. Eventually, the car was backed toward a group of bushes, where it was left largely hidden from view of the street. What happened next was partially visible from the camera. The man brought Doris outside and forced her toward the open trunk. She was placed inside. A faint sound resembling a scream could be heard on the recording, although investigators could not determine with certainty whether it was Doris calling for help. The trunk did not close easily. From inside, Doris was apparently kicking against the lid, preventing it from shutting. The man tried several times before eventually managing to close it. He then got into the vehicle and drove away. According to Doris, the journey that followed was physically difficult. Confined inside the trunk, she became sick and vomited, eventually getting it onto her own shoes. The surveillance footage had now established something important. Doris had not been abducted from the driveway in the manner initially described by the officers. The man had approached the house, entered the property, confronted her there, and later taken her away in her own vehicle. The investigators were left with a more immediate problem. They knew the abduction had occurred. They had a vehicle associated with the suspect. They had surveillance footage showing his movements. But they still did not know who he was or where he had gone. After confirming that Doris's Buick Encore had been taken, officers entered the vehicle into the National Crime Information Center database as stolen. The search for the person who had driven it away could now begin. As investigators continued looking for the person responsible, their attention briefly turned toward someone who lived nearby. Officers were told that the son of one of Doris's neighbors had experienced ongoing conflicts with her, and they decided to speak with him. When approached, the man appeared distracted and resistant to the questions. Officers asked whether he had seen anyone around Doris's property around the time of the incident. He denied seeing anyone and repeatedly said that he kept to himself. The conversation moved in several directions, with the man speaking about his work as a DJ and his efforts to find employment, before returning to the subject of the neighborhood. He did not provide investigators with information connecting him to the abduction. The lead soon lost its significance. There was, however, another development. Providence police officers spotted Doris's stolen Buick Encore within the city. They attempted to stop the vehicle, but the driver did not pull over. Instead, the vehicle continued moving until the driver eventually abandoned it near a residence and ran into the surrounding area. An officer followed on foot. The immediate search focused on the house and the adjoining yards. Officers checked the entrances and considered the possibility that the suspect had gone through a screen door or found another way inside. Other officers arrived and began searching the surrounding property. Information came from people inside the building who believed someone might be in one of the hallways, and officers continued checking the available access points. Permission was obtained from the homeowner to enter the residence. Additional personnel arrived, including a police canine, and the officers moved through the house together before making their way toward the basement. At first, the room appeared empty. Then they noticed someone in a corner. The person had been hiding there. The man was taken into custody and identified as 53-year-old Stephen Henning. His name provided investigators with a new direction. Henning was wanted in Ohio, and further checks showed that he also had an arrest history in Providence. For the moment, the search for the driver of the stolen Buick was over. Henning was placed inside a police cruiser and transported toward the Providence police station. During the journey, an officer continued checking his information and began reviewing the records connected to his name. What appeared at first to be a stolen car arrest was beginning to connect with a much larger record. The officers had yet to hear the full account of what had happened to Doris, and Henning had not yet explained why he had taken her car or what had happened after he left her home. By the time Stephen Henning was brought into the interrogation room, investigators had begun assembling a more complete account of his movements. His records showed previous arrests, including a period of incarceration at the ACI, and officers asked him about an older photograph and how recently he had been released. Henning said he had spent approximately a year there for a stolen car offense. The history was significant because investigators were now dealing with more than a vehicle theft. Doris had described an assault and abduction. Surveillance footage had shown a man entering her property, taking her keys, placing her inside the trunk of her own car, and driving away. The stolen Buick had later been found in Providence, where Henning was arrested after fleeing from police. There was another connection still being established. A Coventry officer who had originally examined Doris's home arrived in Providence and began explaining the surveillance footage to the local officers. While they were discussing what had happened, the owner of the residence where Henning had been arrested came outside. She recognized his name. The woman told investigators that Henning had stayed at her house the previous night. She had met him through a dating application and had known him for approximately a week. When they first met, she said Henning did not have a car. Later, he arrived at her home in a green car, telling her that it belonged to his aunt, who was supposedly in Florida. Investigators already had reason to question that explanation. The green Chevrolet Impala had been found abandoned near Doris's home in Coventry, and it had also been reported stolen. Henning was taken into an interrogation room. Before the questioning began, officers gave him a cigarette and allowed him a few moments to smoke. He appeared unsettled, speaking quietly to himself while waiting for the detective to return. When the detective came back, Henning was read his Miranda rights. The questioning began with the stolen black Buick. Henning offered a simple explanation. He claimed that he had found the vehicle sitting with its engine running in a driveway, and that he had gotten inside and driven away. The detective listened, and then introduced a detail that Henning had not been expecting. He told Henning that investigators had surveillance footage from a nearby property. The recording showed an older woman and a man moving around her home. The detective suggested that the woman on the footage could have been Henning's grandmother. Henning appeared to understand what the detective was implying. The explanation about finding an unattended car was no longer sufficient, and the detective asked him to give his own account of what had happened. Henning then asked whether investigators already knew where the woman was. The detective told him that there was more to the story than simply taking a car, but continued to ask for Henning's version of events. Henning's response was brief. He said that the woman was dead. The statement was inconsistent with what investigators knew. Doris was alive. She had survived the attack and was still receiving medical care. The detective did not immediately tell Henning that she was alive. Instead, he allowed him to continue speaking. Henning explained that he had been driving the stolen green Impala and had begun to believe that his arrest was only a matter of time. As he described the events, investigators were able to begin comparing his account with the evidence they had already gathered. For the first time, the interview was moving beyond the stolen vehicles. Henning was beginning to describe what had happened to Doris, while still apparently unaware that she had survived. Stephen continued explaining what had happened before he reached Doris's home. According to his account, he had been driving the stolen green Chevrolet Impala and looking for another vehicle to take. He said he wanted to find someone who was alone, believing that such a person would be less likely to report an encounter with him. That was when he saw Doris at a Wendy's. Surveillance footage later provided a record of the encounter. Stephen arrived at the restaurant and parked. A short time later, Doris pulled into the same parking area, stopping only a few spaces away from him. Inside, Doris went to the restaurant's soda machines after purchasing her meal. The footage showed her spending some time there, apparently having difficulty with the machine. Stephen approached and offered to help. The two spoke briefly. At the time, Doris did not know that the conversation was significant. She eventually remained inside to eat, while Stephen returned to his vehicle. From there, He could still see her through the restaurant window. When Doris finally left, Stephen followed. During the interrogation, he explained that the conversation had given him information he considered useful. Doris had mentioned that her husband had recently suffered a heart attack, and Stephen asked whether she lived alone. She told him that she did. Stephen said that he then followed her home because he believed she would be an easy target. According to his own account, the decision had already been made before he reached the house. He said he wanted to take a car from someone who would be unlikely to report it, and that he had already intended to kill someone in order to obtain a vehicle. Doris remembered the day differently because she did not remember meeting Stephen at Wendy's. When investigators later asked her about her movements that day, she said she had first gone to church to say a rosary for the sick. She then stopped at Walmart before returning directly home. Her memory of Stephen began at her house. That was where he forced his way inside and began asking questions about her Buick. Doris recalled being confused by the questions. She said Stephen wanted to know whether she owned the car and whether it had been paid for. She told him that the vehicle was in her name. To Doris, the questions had seemed strange. To investigators, they provided another indication of what Stephen had been considering. During the interrogation, Stephen became increasingly emotional as he described the attack. He said that he was not crying because he had been arrested. He said he was crying because of Doris. He described her as a victim who, in his words, had not been the person he wanted to hurt. He also said that he did not normally fight women, while acknowledging that he had killed her. The investigators knew that statement was false. Doris was alive, but Stephen appeared to believe that she had died after being placed inside the trunk. That belief became clearer as he described what he had done after driving away. From Doris's account, investigators already knew that she had been confined inside the trunk for a period of time. She had become sick during the journey and had eventually managed to survive the ordeal. Stephen remembered the same part of the journey differently. He began describing a covering or material he had used while she was inside the vehicle, providing investigators with another piece of information about what he believed had happened after he left her home. The interview continued, and the distance between Stephen's account and Doris's actual condition was becoming increasingly clear. He was confessing to what he believed was a murder. The person he believed he had killed was still alive. Bisa. Saya bisa membuat versi yang tetap true crime, factual, dan tegang sekra halis, tetapi mengurangi detail kekerasan fisik dan unsur seksual yang terlalu explicit. Berikut versinya. Stephen continued describing what happened after leaving Doris's home. During the journey, Doris's view was obstructed, leaving her with only brief impressions of trees and what appeared to be an unpaved road. Eventually, the vehicle stopped in a wooded area somewhere in Smithfield. Stephen forced her out of the car. Doris later told investigators that she was frightened and confused as she found herself surrounded by trees with no nearby houses or other people in sight. She said that Stephen then attacked her and attempted to strangle her. She remembered asking him why he was doing it, particularly because he had previously suggested that she might be able to have her car back. Stephen acknowledged during his interview that he had attempted to strangle Doris, although his description differed from hers regarding exactly how he had done it. At some point, Doris realized that she might survive if Stephen believed she was no longer conscious. She therefore remained as still as possible and tried to control her breathing. According to her account, Stephen eventually stopped. Doris believed that she lost consciousness afterward. When she became aware of her surroundings again, she found herself among the bushes. She was disoriented and frightened, and her clothing had been disturbed during the attack. Investigators carefully asked her about what she remembered, including whether she believed the assault had involved any sexual contact. Doris said that she did not remember such an assault. Stephen, during his interrogation, also insisted that he had not sexually assaulted her. When detectives questioned him about why he had raised the subject himself, he denied having considered it and attempted to explain that his behavior had not been motivated by sexual intent. The investigators continued documenting his statements while comparing them with Doris's account and the evidence already collected. What remained clear was that Doris had been taken from her home, transported to a remote area, and left there after an attack that Stephen believed had been fatal. He was wrong. Doris had survived. At some point after being left among the trees, she regained enough awareness to begin looking for a way out of the area. During the interrogation, Stephen continued trying to explain what he believed had happened in the woods. He insisted that his purpose had been to take a vehicle and that he had not intended to subject Doris to prolonged suffering. He repeatedly told investigators that he had not sexually assaulted her and that, in his mind, the encounter had been about obtaining a car. The available police records do not state whether Doris underwent a forensic examination at the hospital. Because of that, the records cannot establish whether a sexual assault occurred. What the investigators did know was that Doris had survived. After Stephen left her in the wooded area, she eventually began to regain enough strength to move. She described pulling herself upright by holding onto nearby trees. She remained disoriented, but she understood that she needed to leave the area. She told investigators that she kept moving and eventually made her way out of the woods. Her destination was not known to her. She simply continued until she reached a residential neighborhood. Doris approached a stranger's home and rang the doorbell. The resident who answered found an elderly woman in distress and gave her some water before contacting police. By then, investigators were already speaking with Stephen, who still appeared to believe that Doris had died. He told them where he had left her and then revealed another part of his plan. He had intended to return to the area. According to Stephen, he planned to bury Doris and had obtained a shovel for that purpose. Investigators later confirmed that he had purchased one from a Dollar General store after leaving the wooded area. A cashier recalled speaking with him during the purchase and said that Stephen had made a personal remark about asking whether she was single the next time he came into the store. The shovel was later found in the back seat of Doris's car. The discovery provided investigators with another physical connection between Stephen's account and the events surrounding Doris's disappearance. Stephen had believed he was leaving a body behind. Instead, Doris had found a way out of the woods. As the interview continued, Stephen began speaking about finding Doris again. His statements suggested that, despite everything he had already told investigators, he was still thinking about the woman he had left behind and the consequences of what had happened. The investigators now had his account, the surveillance footage, the stolen vehicles, the shovel, and most importantly, a surviving victim whose testimony could be compared with each part of his story. As the interrogation continued, Stephen began discussing events that had taken place before he arrived in Rhode Island. He spoke about an earlier automobile accident and an insurance settlement that followed. According to his account, he received approximately $190,000, while his girlfriend received another amount. He claimed that she later took his portion of the settlement, and that the dispute contributed to his decision to leave Ohio. Stephen also alleged that he had discovered his girlfriend, Michelle, communicating with or seeing her former husband. He described confronting her before he left. His account included a previous incident involving a firearm, for which he said he had faced charges in Ohio. He described an argument during which he threatened Michelle, but then stopped and abandoned the confrontation. According to Stephen, his intention had been to recover his money. He said that after leaving Ohio, he planned to take a vehicle back there and eventually return to Michelle. He told investigators that he had considered killing her after doing so. The statement gave investigators another indication of how serious his intentions had been before his arrest in Rhode Island. Stephen continued insisting that he had not previously considered himself a violent person. He referred investigators to his criminal history and said that he did not have a history of domestic violence. He also expressed remorse for what had happened to Doris. He acknowledged that she had not been responsible for the problems that had led him to Rhode Island. In his account, she had simply become the person he encountered while he was looking for a vehicle. He repeatedly said that she had not deserved what happened to her. By this point, investigators had gathered evidence that extended beyond Stephen's statements. Surveillance footage had documented his movements. The stolen vehicles had connected him to multiple locations. The shovel he purchased after leaving Doris in the woods had been recovered from her car, and Doris herself had survived and provided investigators with an account of the events. Without her survival, and without the available surveillance footage, investigators would have had a much more difficult task establishing the sequence of events. Stephen's statements also suggested that his arrest had interrupted plans that extended beyond Doris. He had been considering returning to Ohio, and he had described another person he believed he wanted to confront there. Investigators collected Stephen's clothing as evidence and continued documenting his statements. He was given additional cigarettes while arrangements were made to transfer him to Coventry for further questioning. Before leaving the Providence interrogation room, Stephen remained visibly distressed. He spoke about Doris with regret, saying that she had been a kind woman and that she had not deserved what happened. He also described what he had done as something he would have to live with. Coventry officers then arrived to take custody of him. As they escorted Stephen toward the elevator, he continued crying. He still believed that Doris had died in the woods. He did not yet know that the woman whose death he had been describing was alive. When Stephen was brought into the Coventry interrogation room, investigators finally gave him the information they had been withholding. The detective told him that they had found Doris. She was alive. Stephen's reaction was immediate. He expressed disbelief and relief, saying that he did not care what punishment awaited him if Doris had survived. The detective explained that he had personally spoken with her. For Stephen, the revelation appeared to change the tone of the interview. Until that moment, he had been describing an event he believed had ended with Doris's death. Now he understood that the person he had left in the woods had survived and had been able to tell investigators what happened. The detective, however, still had questions. There were details in Doris's account that Stephen had not explained. Her clothing had been disturbed, and his earlier statements had not mentioned every aspect of the assault. Investigators also had reason to believe that he had used a belt during the attack, something he had initially failed to disclose. Stephen attributed gaps in his memory to his condition at the time. He said that he had been heavily intoxicated, and that there were portions of the incident he could not remember clearly. He acknowledged drinking alcohol, and said that he had also used marijuana and methamphetamine. The detective clarified the substances Stephen was describing, making sure that his account was understood correctly. As the conversation continued, Stephen's memory appeared to become more specific. He eventually acknowledged using the belt while attacking Doris. Investigators later recovered a belt from a trash container at the Providence police station, adding another physical detail to the evidence being assembled. Stephen continued to express disbelief that Doris had survived. He said that he could not understand how she had managed to live through the attack. At several points, he described himself harshly and said that he had been frightened, intoxicated, and aware that authorities were searching for him. He also spoke about praying during the period when he was on the run, saying that he had wanted to make it back to his family. The statements did not change what had already been established. Doris had survived the attack. The surveillance footage had documented much of Stephen's movements. The stolen vehicles had been recovered, and Stephen had now acknowledged additional details that corresponded with evidence investigators had already collected. His explanations continued to focus on his intoxication, fear, and state of mind at the time. The investigators continued recording his account, separating what could be supported by evidence from what remained his own explanation of events. As the interrogation continued, Stephen returned to his criminal record and insisted that it contained no history of violence. The detective pointed out that, whatever his previous record showed, there was one significant fact that remained in his favor at that moment. There was no murder charge arising from Doris's attack because Doris had survived. Stephen appeared to struggle with that distinction. He repeatedly said that he needed help and questioned how he could live with what he had done. He also spoke about his tattoos, explaining that some of them had been done by his brother and did not represent the person he believed himself to be. The detective listened as Stephen moved between describing himself as a bad person and insisting that he was not a monster. He asked how he could change what he had done and how he was supposed to live with it. The detective told him to take things one step at a time. Stephen also described feeling alone and overwhelmed by what had happened. Despite his repeated references to alcohol and drugs, investigators had evidence that portions of the events had involved deliberate decisions. He had been looking for a vehicle. He had followed Doris after speaking with her at Wendy's. He had learned that she lived alone. He had followed her home. He had taken her car. He had later purchased a shovel and told investigators that he intended to return to the area where he had left her. He had also spoken about returning to Ohio and confronting Michelle. The evidence therefore gave investigators a sequence of actions that extended beyond a single moment of impaired judgment. Stephen did not deny the basic events. Instead, he repeatedly tried to explain the state he had been in when they occurred, saying that he had been intoxicated, frightened, and not thinking clearly. The detective then gave him an opportunity to address Doris directly. Stephen offered an apology, acknowledging that the words could not undo what had happened, but saying that he was sorry. The investigation eventually moved into the court system. According to court documents, Stephen Henning pleaded guilty to 11 offenses, including first-degree robbery, breaking and entering, kidnapping, assault with a dangerous weapon, and 2 counts of assault on a person over the age of 60. He received a sentence of 55 years, with 20 years suspended, followed by a consecutive 10-year habitual offender sentence. The case was also publicly acknowledged by the Coventry Police Department, which praised Doris for her courage and described her as an exceptionally strong survivor. The department noted that the ordeal she endured was extraordinarily difficult, while emphasizing that she had survived and helped investigators establish what had happened. The department later stated that the sentence meant Stephen would spend the next 45 years behind bars. For investigators, the case had begun with an elderly woman arriving at a hospital with an account that initially seemed difficult to reconcile with the condition of her home. The surveillance footage had provided the missing sequence. The stolen vehicles had led officers to Stephen, and Doris's survival had allowed investigators to compare his statements against the account of the person who had actually lived through the events. The final record did not end with the death Stephen had initially described. It ended with Doris alive, Stephen convicted, and the investigation documented through the evidence gathered along the way. Story 4. On the afternoon of March 9, 2020, the Elko County Sheriff's Office in Nevada received a report from a concerned mother regarding her 16-year-old daughter, Gabrielle Ulick, who was known as Brittany. Brittany had not returned home the previous day. Her mother, Alicia, was already trying to establish a simple account of where her daughter had been and who had last seen her. One of the first names to emerge was Bryce Dickey, a teenager who had been with Brittany earlier. According to the information given to Alicia, Bryce had dropped Brittany off near the local high school at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He had not been alone with her. There had been another young man with them, someone Brittany had apparently described as a new friend. Alicia had asked who the young man was. The answer was that he was not known to Bryce. He had simply been introduced as Brittany's new friend. By the time the report was made, Brittany's friends could not locate her, and her phone was no longer operating. Alicia described her daughter as a generally happy, ordinary 16-year-old. Brittany had never disappeared from home before, and the incidents that had brought her into contact with police had been relatively minor. On one occasion, officers had found her in possession of marijuana. Even when Brittany went out and made what her mother considered poor decisions, there was usually some explanation afterward. There would be a phone call or some account of what had happened. This time there was nothing. Brittany was not attending Spring Creek High School in the usual way. According to her mother, she was being homeschooled, and Alicia said that Brittany had accumulated a number of enemies. When asked why she believed her daughter had enemies, Alicia referred to several previous conflicts. She recalled an incident at a rodeo in which Brittany had been attacked by 4 girls. She also mentioned a separate matter involving a person whom she said had attempted to rape Brittany the previous year. That person, Alicia said, continued to intimidate Brittany whenever they encountered one another. There had been a police report concerning the earlier allegation. However, when a detective later needed Brittany to come in and speak about it, she had been unable to do so. At the time of the missing person report, these earlier incidents remained part of the background surrounding Brittany's disappearance. They did not, by themselves, establish what had happened to her. Alicia was also receiving calls from Brittany's father. He had become increasingly concerned because Brittany was not answering her phone, and he had apparently not yet made an official missing person report. Alicia described the conversation as difficult for her. Her daughter's father was frightened and was already imagining the possibility that Brittany had been seriously harmed. For Alicia, there was still no certainty about where her daughter was. There was only the absence of an answer. Investigators began asking about the people who had last been in contact with Brittany. One of those people was Bryce Dickey. Brittany's brother, James, had been communicating with her friends and was able to provide investigators with some information about Bryce. He understood that Bryce had been the person who dropped Brittany off. The circumstances surrounding the drop-off were not entirely clear. James said that Bryce had not been able to give a particularly good description of the other young man. The person had apparently been wearing a cowboy hat and was taller than Bryce's truck. It was not much to work with. There was, however, one detail that remained consistent in the early accounts. Brittany had been seen with Bryce. Bryce had then dropped her off, and after that, the people around her could no longer establish where she had gone. Alicia continued to provide investigators with names of people who had previously had conflicts with her daughter. Some of those names were connected to arguments or physical confrontations, while others came from more serious allegations. Among them was the person Alicia said had attempted to rape Brittany the year before. She told investigators that this individual continued to terrorize her daughter whenever they crossed paths. The earlier police report existed, but the investigation had not produced a complete account from Brittany herself because she had been unable to sit down with the detective when requested. As the missing person investigation began, those earlier circumstances remained among the pieces investigators had to consider. At that point, there were several separate threads. There was a 16-year-old girl who had not returned home. There was a phone that was no longer answering. There were friends who could not locate her. There was Bryce Dickey, who had reportedly dropped her off. There was an unidentified young man wearing a cowboy hat, and there were people from Brittany's past whom her mother believed might have had reason to hurt her. None of those details, considered individually, provided a complete explanation. They were simply the first pieces available to investigators. The search would depend on determining which of them belonged to Brittany's disappearance, and which belonged only to the circumstances surrounding it. A green truck was one of the few descriptions investigators had to work with. It was believed to be a Ford, possibly an F-150, with a dark green or forest green appearance. Beyond that, the information was limited. The driver was unidentified, and no one close to Brittany seemed to know who the person was. After the deputy left, the search continued through the night. Police officers, family members, friends, and people who knew Brittany began looking for her. Bryce Dickey, who had been with her earlier that afternoon, also joined the search. The effort continued into the early morning hours, but there was no indication of where Brittany had gone. As time passed, investigators returned to the last known sequence of events. Bryce had been one of the people who saw Brittany shortly before she disappeared. If his account could establish where she had gone and who she had met, it might provide a more complete starting point for the investigation. Bryce told investigators that on Sunday, at approximately 11 o'clock, he had received several messages from Brittany. She asked whether he wanted to spend some time together. He picked her up at Angel Park. From there, according to Bryce, they drove around the Horse Palace rodeo area while talking about school and other ordinary matters. He said they remained together for several hours. Later, Brittany asked him to do one more thing for her. She wanted him to drop her off at the high school because she was supposed to meet her new friend there. She told Bryce that her father would pick her up afterward. Bryce described arriving at the school and pulling into the area where he dropped her off. He said they hugged. Brittany got out of his vehicle, and he watched her leave. There was another vehicle nearby. It was the Ford F-150 that Brittany had apparently been going to meet. Bryce said he had noticed it, although he did not initially understand that it was connected to the person Brittany intended to meet. When investigators asked him to describe the vehicle, Bryce recalled a dark green color, similar to winter green or forest green. He did not remember the windows being tinted. There were stickers on the rear window. He had not been able to read them. After leaving Brittany at the school, Bryce said he did not hear from her again. He went home and sent her a message through Snapchat. Later, after Brittany had officially been reported missing, he joined the people searching for her. The basic timeline appeared straightforward. Bryce said he had picked Brittany up at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon and dropped her off at around 4:30. That placed them together for roughly 3.5 hours. The sergeant conducting the interview asked what they had done during that period. Bryce explained that they had driven around and talked. The answer did not immediately provide much detail beyond that. The sergeant noted that spending several hours driving without a particular destination seemed unusual, and he asked Bryce whether there was anything else about the afternoon that he had not yet mentioned. Bryce said there was not. The interview remained focused on the same point. Investigators wanted a complete account while the sequence of events was still being established. The sergeant told Bryce that this was the appropriate time to provide everything he knew, emphasizing that Brittany's disappearance was a serious matter. He also warned that withholding information or deliberately misleading investigators could have consequences. Bryce continued to maintain that he was not leaving anything out. He also said that he and Brittany had been communicating through Snapchat before he picked her up. Investigators asked whether those messages were still available on his phone. Bryce agreed to look. The exchange provided a small amount of additional information. One message from Brittany contained an address where Bryce could pick her up. Another message asked whether she should begin walking over. The messages gave investigators a record of contact between the two before their meeting. Later, during the 6 o'clock hour, Bryce sent additional messages after Brittany stopped responding. He was concerned that she was not answering her phone. There was no reply from Brittany. The messages ended there. By then, The known sequence contains several points that could be independently examined. The earlier Snapchat communication, Bryce's pickup at Angel Park, the hours they spent together, the drop-off near the high school, Brittany's intention to meet an unidentified person, and the dark green Ford truck that had been waiting nearby. The identity of the person associated with that truck remained unknown. Brittany had not answered the messages sent afterward, and the search that had begun during the night had still produced no sign of her. The concern surrounding Brittany's disappearance increased as investigators and those close to her considered the circumstances of her last known movements. Bryce said it was unusual for Brittany to leave with someone her friends and family did not know. He also described her as someone who normally communicated frequently by phone, particularly with her father. According to Bryce, Brittany had previously gotten into trouble, and because of that history, she tended to keep her father informed about where she was. He did not describe the relationship as abusive, but said Brittany was cautious about getting into trouble with him and would usually send messages. When asked whether Brittany's father was overprotective, Bryce said he was unsure and explained that his own relationship with Brittany's father was limited. The conversation returned to the search. Investigators were still trying to determine whether anyone had been able to identify the driver of the green Ford truck. The vehicle remained one of the few physical descriptions connected to Brittany's final known movements. There was also a practical limitation. Investigators learned that surveillance cameras that might once have covered the area were no longer operating. The available footage was therefore limited, and there was little immediate information about the truck or the person driving it. The search continued outside the immediate area of the school. Several trained volunteers joined the effort, establishing a search base approximately 7 miles from the location where Bryce said he had dropped Brittany off. During the search, one of the volunteers noticed something beneath or near a blue tarp. He moved closer to examine it. The object appeared to contain human remains. The volunteers contacted authorities, and investigators responded to the location. The remains appeared to belong to a woman. A driver's license was found nearby, although the identity of the deceased was not immediately confirmed. The body was partially clothed and was still wearing black high-heeled boots. Investigators also observed injuries consistent with a violent death. The woman had been stabbed. At that point, there was still no official confirmation that the deceased was Brittany. The discovery was made on March 11th, 2 days after the missing person investigation had begun. An investigator received the information while meeting with Brittany's mother in person. Although the identity of the woman had not yet been established, he decided that the circumstances required him to tell Alicia that a body had been found. He explained that the remains had not yet been identified. Alicia reacted immediately and became overwhelmed by the possibility that the discovery involved her daughter. She struggled to remain standing and asked for help. The investigator continued to make clear that the identity was not yet known. There was still a distinction between the discovery of a deceased woman and confirmation that Brittany was dead. That distinction remained for a short time. 2 days later, the search ended with the identification of the body. The deceased woman was Gabrielle Ulick, known as Brittany. The medical examiner later determined that Brittany had died from a stab wound to the neck and strangulation. Investigators considered the possibility that Brittany had resisted her attacker and collected fingernail clippings for forensic examination. Other evidence was documented at the scene. Investigators recovered chewing tobacco spit and Brittany's keys, which were attached to a lanyard bearing her name. They also photographed tire tracks in the area. The tracks initially appeared to offer another possible connection to the dark green Ford pickup described by Bryce. However, the condition of the ground limited what investigators could determine. According to court documents, there were too many rocks in the area to obtain a sufficiently clear tire impression. The potential vehicle lead could therefore not be developed as conclusively as investigators had hoped. With Brittany identified and the circumstances of her death established, investigators returned to the people and vehicles associated with her final known movements. Bryce was brought in for additional questioning. His earlier account had established that he was with Brittany for several hours before dropping her off, and that he had seen the green Ford pickup near the school. Investigators now needed to examine that account again in light of what had been discovered. When Bryce returned for additional questioning, investigators began by asking about his relationship with Brittany. He said they had been close friends since approximately 7th or 8th grade. Their relationship had become familiar enough that Brittany referred to him as her big brother, and the name he had saved for her in his phone was Little Sis. Bryce explained that this had also become a source of difficulty during an earlier conversation with police. An investigator had questioned why, if Brittany was like a younger sister to him, he did not know more about her personal life or the people around her. Bryce acknowledged that there were things he did not know. Investigators asked whether Brittany had ever spoken to him about people she was having problems with, or anyone she might have been interested in. Bryce said that many people had conflicts with Brittany, but nothing he had seen or heard suggested the outcome that had now occurred. The questioning then returned to the afternoon, when Bryce dropped Brittany off. Investigators told him that they had understood him to have provided a description of the person associated with the green truck. Bryce disagreed with that characterization. He said that he had repeatedly been told he had given a description, but that the only feature he could actually remember seeing was a cowboy hat. He could not provide a more detailed description of the person's face, clothing, age, or other identifying characteristics. With the eyewitness information limited, investigators turned toward the digital evidence. Bryce provided Brittany's Snapchat username and allowed investigators access to his phone. They also asked whether there was anything on the phone that he would be concerned about them finding. Bryce said there was not. Investigators then asked whether there was any reason his DNA might be found on Brittany or on her belongings. Bryce said that, apart from something incidental such as a hair possibly remaining on her jacket, he was not aware of any reason his DNA would be present. He denied having a sexual relationship with Brittany. The investigators continued asking about people Brittany knew at school, and whether there was anyone who might have become angry with her after being rejected. They also asked questions about her relationships with boys. Bryce said that, based on what he had been told by people around her, Brittany had not yet been sexually involved with anyone. The interview remained focused on establishing the people who had been close to Brittany and determining whether any of those relationships might have been relevant to her death. Before the questioning ended, investigators asked Bryce whether he would provide a DNA sample. He agreed to submit a buccal swab. Bryce then asked a question of his own. He wanted to know whether investigators could tell him how Brittany had been killed. The investigator said that he did not know what information could be released to him at that point. Bryce explained that he had heard different accounts circulating online and had encountered several conflicting versions of what had happened. The rumors had left him uncertain about which information, if any, was accurate. Investigators continued working to establish the facts independently of those reports. The physical evidence was still incomplete. Brittany's cell phone, in particular, had not been recovered at the location where her body was found. The following day, investigators returned to the basin. The second search produced additional evidence. Among the items recovered was Brittany's broken cell phone. Investigators also found a used condom discarded in vegetation near the area where the body had been discovered. The phone was significant because it had been absent during the initial examination of the scene. Its recovery provided investigators with another piece of digital and physical evidence to examine as they continued assembling the circumstances surrounding Brittany's final movements and death. During the additional interview, investigators again asked Bryce about his relationship with Brittany. Bryce said they had been close friends since approximately 7th or 8th grade. Over time, their friendship had taken on a familial quality. Brittany called him Big Brother, and he had saved her name in his phone as Little Sis. He explained that this had been one of the subjects discussed during an earlier conversation with police. An investigator had questioned why Bryce did not know more about Brittany if they were supposedly so close. Bryce said there were simply things about her life that he did not know. Investigators asked whether Brittany had ever spoken to him about people she was having problems with, or about anyone she was interested in. Bryce said that many people had problems with Brittany, but he had never seen anything that suggested those conflicts would lead to what had happened to her. The investigators then returned to the final time Bryce had seen Brittany. They reminded him that deputies had said he initially provided a description of the person associated with the green truck. Bryce clarified that he had not actually been able to describe the person in any meaningful detail. The only feature he remembered was a cowboy hat. That was all. With no useful physical description of the driver, investigators turned their attention toward Brittany's digital activity. They were looking for information that might help establish where she had been and who she had been communicating with before her death. Bryce provided Brittany's Snapchat username and handed investigators his cell phone. He was asked whether there was anything on the device that he would be concerned about investigators discovering. He said no. Investigators then asked whether there was any reason his DNA might be found on Brittany or on her clothing. Bryce said there was not, other than something incidental, such as a hair that might have remained on her jacket. When asked directly whether he had been sexually involved with Brittany, he denied having such a relationship. The investigators also asked about people at the school who might have become frustrated or angry with Brittany, particularly anyone she had rejected. They asked about her relationships with boys more generally. Bryce said that, according to what he had heard from others, Brittany had not been sexually involved with anyone. The questions remained part of the broader effort to establish who had been close to Brittany and whether any relationship might have been relevant to her death. Investigators then asked Bryce to provide a DNA sample. He agreed to submit a buccal swab. Before the interview ended, Bryce asked whether investigators were able to tell him how Brittany had been killed. The investigator said he did not know whether that information could be provided. Bryce explained that he had heard numerous versions of the story online. Some accounts contradicted others, and he said he did not know what information was actually true. At that stage, investigators continued to work from evidence rather than the rumors circulating among people following the case. There were still important pieces of evidence that had not been located. One of them was Brittany's cell phone. It had not been recovered during the initial search of the area where her body was found. The following day, investigators returned to the basin. During this second examination, they located Brittany's broken phone. They also found a used condom discarded in the bushes nearby. The recovery of the phone added another physical item connected to Brittany's final movements, while the condom became another piece of evidence that investigators would need to examine as they continued reconstructing what had happened at the scene. The recovery of the condom introduced another piece of evidence into the investigation. When investigators confronted Bryce about DNA found on it, he appeared surprised. He said he had never had sex with Brittany. Investigators told him that the forensic evidence did not fit that statement. They explained that his DNA had been identified on the inside of the condom, while Brittany's DNA was found on the outside. Bryce was told that there was only a limited explanation for how the evidence could have been deposited in that manner. The questioning also returned to inconsistencies that investigators had identified in his earlier statements. Bryce acknowledged that he had lied. The timeline was another issue. According to police records, geolocation information associated with Bryce's and Brittany's Snapchat accounts placed the two together at approximately 3:22 in the afternoon. Their movements led them to the basin where Brittany took 2 Snapchat photographs of herself. The records indicated that Bryce remained in the area until approximately 5:25 p.m., when he left and returned home. Less than an hour later, Bryce sent Brittany 4 final Snapchat messages. She did not respond. The last recorded location associated with Brittany was the same basin where her body was later found. The digital evidence therefore provided investigators with a more detailed account of the movements during the period surrounding Brittany's disappearance. During the interrogation, Bryce continued trying to explain the evidence. At one point, he suggested that Brittany had behaved unusually flirtatiously toward him that day. He said that they had kissed and offered an explanation involving a condom, attempting to account for the forensic evidence without acknowledging a sexual assault. His account continued to change. Investigators questioned him about another teenager whom he suggested could have been responsible. Bryce said that person was distinctive enough that investigators should be able to identify him. The investigators returned to the central problem. Bryce had initially been the person who described dropping Brittany off. He had been among the last people known to have seen her alive. Now, after investigators had spent days working through the evidence, he was providing different versions of what had happened. One investigator confronted him with the fact that he had allowed others to believe he was the last person to see Brittany alive while, according to his latest account, he claimed to know that someone else had seen her afterward. Bryce responded that he understood the position this placed him in. He said he had effectively allowed himself to remain the person everyone believed had last seen Brittany, even though he claimed to know otherwise. The questioning became increasingly direct. Investigators reminded Bryce that they had spent the previous week and a half working on the case and examining the evidence. They challenged his explanation of how the physical evidence had come together at the basin. Bryce continued to deny killing Brittany. He was asked whether the account he was giving was the story he intended to maintain. He said that it was. The investigation eventually moved into the court system. According to court documents, Bryce Dickey, who was 18 at the time, was charged with first-degree murder and sexual assault, with both charges involving the use of a deadly weapon. The case proceeded to trial. A jury convicted Bryce on all counts. On August 10, 2022, he received an aggregate sentence of life in prison, with eligibility for parole after 46 years. Brittany's mother later addressed Bryce in a victim impact statement. She spoke about her daughter and about the consequences of Brittany's death, telling him that the loss of her daughter would prevent him from harming anyone else. In 2024, the Nevada Supreme Court rejected Bryce Dickey's appeal seeking to overturn his conviction. The conviction therefore remained in place, as did the sentence imposed following the jury's verdict. Story 5. The house was small and set back slightly from the road, the kind of place that did not usually produce urgent calls late at night, and when officers arrived they did not immediately force entry because the front area appeared quiet. But the stillness did not last once they began to see what had been left behind in plain sight. There were red stains in more than one area of the house, not concentrated in a single place, and there were footprints that appeared to move both into and out of the rooms, overlapping in a way that suggested movement had continued after the first signs of injury, although at that time the sequence was not yet clear. It would later become known that the chain of events connected back to a short text message, something brief and ordinary in form, and yet it would sit near the center of the timeline once the records were reviewed in full. One of the statements collected during the early stage of the case contained a repeated sentence. "I do not want to hear anything. I do not want to hear anything. And if something bad happens to me, do not tell me." Another statement, recorded separately, included a line that investigators would return to later because of how directly it acknowledged the outcome without explaining it. "Andrew is no longer with us, and there is a reason why that happened, but we do not know the reason yet." The events that led to that house began several years earlier, in the year 2009, when a man named Andrew Wagner went to an adult dance club in Massachusetts, where he met a dancer named Stephanie Fernandez, and the two began talking in a way that extended beyond a brief introduction and continued for close to an hour. Stephanie would later describe Andrew as 26 years old at the time, with blue eyes, a strong build from regular workouts, and a personality she believed was easy to trust, and Andrew, for his part, asked for her phone number before leaving that night, which led to them seeing each other again not long after. Within 1 month, they were living together in an apartment in Worcester, and Stephanie's young daughter from a previous marriage, Angelina Fernandez, lived with them as well, forming a household that, by most outward descriptions, appeared stable and routine. Andrew was not yet financially established, and at that time he was working at a tire shop located at a Costco, but he told Stephanie that he wanted to work in law enforcement, which he described not as a distant idea, but as a plan he intended to follow through. In October 2013, he obtained a job as a prison guard in Connecticut, which required a commute of approximately 1 hour from the apartment, and although the distance added strain to the daily schedule, the three of them continued living together and maintained a routine that included evenings at home watching television, often the show Criminal Minds, sitting together on the couch. During vacations and summers, they traveled to Cape Cod, a well-known destination in Massachusetts with beaches, resorts, historical sites, and small art centers, and these trips became part of what Stephanie described as their normal life together, a pattern that included visits to family homes and discussions about marriage and having children in the future. At some point after Andrew began his new job, the couple became engaged and set a wedding date for August 2014, and in January 2014 they moved into a new house, intending to settle there more permanently and build a long-term family life in that location. The move would later be marked in the timeline as one of the last major changes before the incident. Several months after they moved in, on the night of May 7, 2014, at approximately 11 o'clock, a call was made to emergency services from inside that house. The caller reported that Andrew and Stephanie had been involved in a serious argument inside the house, and this information was logged before officers arrived, which meant that from the beginning the incident was treated not as an unknown intrusion, but as a domestic disturbance that had escalated into medical emergency. When officers entered the house, Andrew was found on the floor between the bathroom and the kitchen area, lying on his back with severe injury to his neck, and there was a large amount of blood around him and along parts of the floor that suggested movement had occurred after the injury was inflicted. His breathing at that time was shallow and irregular, and although he was still alive when first responders reached him, the condition was already critical. Before police and ambulance personnel arrived, Several neighbors had already entered the house after hearing Stephanie screaming for help, and one of those neighbors was an emergency medical technician who immediately attempted to provide aid while waiting for additional medical personnel to arrive. Stephanie was present in the house during this time and appeared extremely distressed, crying loudly, shaking, and unable to respond clearly to questions, and officers noted that her hands were trembling and that she seemed unable to remain still or provide a structured explanation of what had happened. Angelina, who was 11 years old at the time, was also inside the house and remained at a distance, watching but not intervening, and later statements indicated that she had been asleep earlier in the evening before the argument escalated. Medical personnel transported Andrew to the hospital, but he was later pronounced dead by authorities as a result of the injuries to his neck. Stephanie was taken to the police station that same night, still visibly distressed and with blood on her body and clothing, and investigators at that stage considered her the primary person involved because there were no immediate signs of forced entry, and because the emergency call had originated from inside the home. She was questioned for approximately 3 hours, and during that interview officers observed that she remained highly anxious, frequently shifting in her seat, speaking rapidly at times and then becoming incoherent, and her behavior was described as panicked rather than controlled. During the interview, she was informed that Andrew had died, and after hearing this she began speaking in a disorganized way, making statements that were difficult to follow, and at one point she stated clearly that she had struck Andrew in the neck with a sharp object, which she said she had done to defend herself. She told investigators that earlier that night they had argued, initially about her working on Sundays, which Andrew questioned and did not believe her explanation for, and according to her statement the argument continued and became more intense as the night went on. She said that Andrew accused her of cheating on him while he was at work, and that he believed she was seeing other men, something she denied but said he would not accept. In her account, she said Andrew became increasingly angry and that she believed he might harm her, and she also said she was afraid for Angelina, who was asleep in her room at the time. One statement collected later from a nearby resident included a brief description of what could be heard from outside the house during the argument. Stephanie also told investigators that Andrew had weapons, and that she believed he had threatened her with both a sharp object and a firearm during the argument, and she described his behavior that night as different from usual, more aggressive and unpredictable, and she said she believed she might be killed. Investigators noted that Andrew had, in the past, expressed strong suspicion that Stephanie was unfaithful, and these accusations were described as recurring in their relationship, particularly because of Stephanie's past work as an exotic dancer and the number of men she knew through that environment, which Andrew reportedly found difficult to accept or ignore. These details would later become part of the broader attempt to understand what had happened inside the house during the hours before the emergency call, although at that stage the sequence of events was still being assembled from statements, physical evidence, and recorded communications. Although Stephanie was in a relationship with Andrew and living with him, phone records and later statements indicated that she remained in contact with a number of people she had known before the relationship, and this became one of the recurring sources of conflict between them, particularly for Andrew, who believed that these communications were evidence of infidelity. According to Stephanie's statement, Andrew's jealousy sometimes turned physical, and she described multiple incidents in which arguments escalated into physical confrontation inside the home, including pushing and hitting, which she said had happened more than once prior to the night of May 7th. On the night of the incident, she said the argument became physical again and that they struggled with each other in the house before falling to the floor, and she stated that she was able to break away from him and move toward the kitchen area, where she took a sharp object from the kitchen. Andrew followed her into that area, and according to her account, he continued yelling and moved toward her, and she shouted repeatedly for him to stay away from her while holding the object in front of her. She said he demanded that she give the object to him and continued moving closer, and she described the moment that followed as quick and not fully controlled, stating that when he reached toward her, the blade moved and cut into the back area of his neck. After the injury, Andrew stepped back and blood began to spread across his shoulder and upper body, and she said he spoke to her and indicated that he believed he was seriously injured, after which she said she froze and did not move for a short period of time because she did not understand how severe the injury was. She then tried to find her phone to call for help, but said she could not locate it immediately, and because she was shaking and unable to think clearly, she began yelling for help instead, which was what alerted the neighbors. Angelina woke up during this time and came out of her room, and she saw blood on the floor and heard her mother shouting, and this moment would later be included in the timeline as occurring shortly before neighbors entered the house. When police examined Stephanie at the scene, they observed injuries on her arms and face, which were documented, and these injuries were noted because they were consistent with her statement that there had been a physical struggle prior to the stabbing. As investigators continued to examine the background of the relationship, they found that the relationship between Stephanie and Andrew had been unstable for some time, with repeated breakups and reconciliations, and during one of the periods when she and Andrew were separated, Stephanie had been in a relationship with another man named Mike Lamari. Records and statements later showed that for a period of time Stephanie had been involved with both men at the same time without either of them fully aware of the overlap, and that she had arranged her schedule so that she spent weekdays with one and weekends with the other, depending on Andrew's work schedule. Mike Lamari was described as financially stable and, according to Stephanie, treated her well and paid for trips, including a trip to Niagara Falls, where he gave her a ring valued at approximately $44,000. At that time, she already had a ring from Andrew, and she later admitted that she wore the rings at different times depending on which man she was with. Eventually, she ended the relationship with Mike and returned to living full-time with Andrew, but she later stated that this decision was not based on affection alone, and that she was afraid of what Andrew might do if she left him. And she also said she was afraid that Andrew might harm Mike if he discovered the full extent of the relationship. These statements became part of the broader reconstruction of the relationship dynamics, which investigators reviewed alongside the physical evidence and the timeline from the night Andrew died, although the exact sequence of movements inside the house continued to be examined in detail during the investigation that followed. Sometime after Stephanie and Andrew resumed living together full-time, the incident occurred that resulted in Andrew's death, and as investigators continued examining the relationship history, they found information indicating that conflict between the two had not been one-sided, and that there had been prior incidents involving threats and physical confrontation. Statements and past incident records indicated that Stephanie had, on multiple occasions, threatened both Andrew and a former partner, Mike Lamari, with a sharp object during arguments, although in those earlier incidents neither man sustained severe injury, and no formal police reports were filed at the time. Mike Lamari later described several confrontations in which Stephanie became extremely angry and armed herself with a knife, and he said that during those incidents he avoided injury by using nearby objects as barriers and by keeping distance between them until she calmed down, and in one incident he reported that she threw a knife and he used a chair as a shield, after which she struck the chair repeatedly. These accounts were included in the case file not as conclusions, but as part of the behavioral history investigators were assembling while trying to understand the pattern of conflict surrounding the relationship. At the same time, there were also multiple statements indicating that Andrew had been physically violent towards Stephanie during their relationship, and photographs and witness observations documented injuries on her arms and legs on more than one occasion. A friend of Stephanie's named Daniel later gave a statement in which he said he had seen bruises on her arms that appeared to be hand-shaped, and that he had once helped her cover bruises on her legs using makeup because she did not want them to be visible while working. Stephanie stated that Andrew was extremely jealous and often became angry about her clothing, her work, and her contact with other people, and she described incidents in which arguments became physical, including being pushed onto a bed, having her clothing torn, and being threatened with a firearm that she said Andrew pressed against her neck during one of their confrontations. Angelina, who was 11 years old at the time of the incident, later confirmed in an interview that Andrew could become suddenly angry and that his behavior would change quickly during arguments, and she described him as becoming red-faced with widened eyes and acting like a different person when he was angry. Stephanie also stated that not all of Andrew's anger appeared without cause, and that she sometimes provoked him intentionally, including sending text messages designed to make him jealous, and one of the messages recovered during the investigation contained a statement in which she told him she would sleep with one of his friends. Investigators noted that this message was sent prior to one of their major arguments, and that it contributed to escalating tension between them. During the background investigation, police also discovered that Stephanie had a prior criminal record that included assaulting her mother when she was a teenager, breaking into a former boyfriend's home in Leicester, and damaging a vehicle by removing a door handle and breaking the windshield. These past incidents were included in the broader case file, as part of her documented history of conflict and aggressive behavior. Following Andrew's death, his family publicly stated that they believed Stephanie was responsible and that they believed she had taken advantage of Andrew financially and emotionally, and they requested that the court impose the most severe penalty available under the law. These statements were recorded as part of the post-incident record, alongside the physical evidence, the medical findings, the text message records, and the interviews conducted with Stephanie, Angelina, and other witnesses connected to the case. After Andrew's death, members of his family stated that his personality had changed noticeably during the period of his relationship with Stephanie, and they described him as becoming more withdrawn, quieter, and less communicative with his parents than he had been previously, which they believed reflected ongoing stress in his personal life. These statements were included in the case record as part of the victim background, along with testimony regarding the nature of the relationship and the conflicts that had been described by both sides. The case moved into the court system, and in the year 2015 the trial process formally began, during which Stephanie faced charges related to Andrew's death, and during this period prosecutors also added charges that she had intimidated witnesses and threatened some of Andrew's friends, which became separate legal issues connected to the main case. 2 years later, in the year 2017, the charge related to causing Andrew's death was dismissed by the court, which did not end the legal process, but instead created a pause in the prosecution while legal arguments and appeals continued. In the year 2019, the charge related to Andrew's death was filed again, and the case returned to court, continuing the legal process that had remained unresolved for several years. In October of the year 2022, Stephanie was found guilty and sentenced to a prison term of 8 to 10 years, and under the terms of that sentence, she became eligible to apply for parole in the year 2026. During the years following the incident, Angelina was raised by her grandparents, and records indicate that she continued her education and later entered college, where she chose to study forensic psychology, with the stated intention of working in a field related to helping victims, particularly children involved in violent or domestic cases. In her statements, she continued to maintain that she believed her mother had been harmed and threatened by Andrew, and she expressed the hope that she would be reunited with her mother after her release. The case file, when read in full from beginning to end, contains statements from both sides, prior incident reports, medical findings, text message records, witness accounts, and court decisions spread across more than a decade, and the sequence of events that began with a relationship in 2009 ultimately concluded with a conviction in 2022. Although many of the personal disputes and private moments that led to the final confrontation inside the house remain, documented only through conflicting statements and partial records. Story 6. The case continued to be discussed for years, not because of complexity in motive or investigation, but because the nature of what happened seemed to resist ordinary explanation. And even when the sequence of events was laid out in full, many people still felt that the facts did not settle into something that felt proportionate or understandable. Ino Fariha was born on the 6th of October, 1997, in Libak Wangi, Sarang, Banten, to Arif Fikri and Maputo. She grew up in a family that was generally described as warm and supportive, and people who knew her during childhood and adolescence often described her as attentive to others, particularly to close friends and neighbors, which was mentioned repeatedly in early interviews collected after her death. When she reached adulthood, she began looking for work with the specific intention of helping her family financially, while also saving money for university. She was eventually hired by PT Polita Global Mandiri, a manufacturing factory that produced plastic bags, where she worked as an operator, a position that required speed, consistency, and attention to repetitive detail over long shifts. Because the distance between the factory and her family home was considerable, Ino stayed in the employee dormitory provided near the workplace. During her time working there, supervisors and co-workers described her as diligent, disciplined, and responsible, and over time she was able to save enough money to continue her education. She later enrolled at Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia while continuing to work. At the dormitory, she shared daily life with several close co-workers, including Aro, Tikro, and Nopi. They lived in the same housing area and developed a routine of leaving for work together, returning together, and maintaining regular contact, which made her sudden absence in May 2016 noticeable very quickly. During that month, Ino stopped coming to work without submitting any notice or explanation, and this was considered unusual because she had no prior record of unexplained absence. Her co-workers did not see her for several days, and the door to her dormitory room remained closed the entire time. Because the situation did not match her usual behavior, Arrow, Tycro, and Nopi contacted Ino's family to ask whether she had returned home without informing anyone. At the same time, her parents believed she was still at work and assumed she had been too busy to call, which meant that for several days, both sides believed she was with the other. After realizing that no one had actually seen her, her co-workers decided to check her room directly. When they arrived, they saw that the door was locked from the outside. This detail did not immediately cause alarm, because it was still possible she had gone somewhere and locked the door before leaving, but they called her name several times while knocking, and there was no response from inside. They then asked several male employees nearby to help force the door open. When the door opened, the three women began screaming and crying almost immediately after seeing the condition inside the room. Ino was lying on the bed, already deceased, and the condition of the body indicated extreme violence. She was found without clothing, and across her body there were multiple severe injuries. A hoe handle had been forced into her body, causing catastrophic internal damage. The scene itself indicated that the assault had been prolonged and involved significant physical force. Human voice. The room showed signs of a struggle, but no clear sign of forced entry. Police arrived not long after the report was made and secured the scene before transporting Ino's body to RSUD Tangerang for autopsy. The medical examination later concluded that she had suffered massive internal injuries, particularly to the pelvic area, abdomen, and chest, which led to fatal damage to internal organs including the lungs. She had also lost approximately 500 cubic centimeters of blood. Medical staff confirmed that the injuries were caused by blunt force and internal penetration with a large blunt object, consistent with the hoe handle found at the scene. X-ray imaging clearly showed the position and depth of the object inside the body, which matched the external injuries documented during the examination. While the autopsy was being conducted, investigators began examining every part of Ino's dormitory room, documenting the position of objects, signs of disturbance, and any items that did not belong in the room or were out of place, working slowly through the space in a way that suggested they believed the room itself still contained unanswered questions. Investigators then noticed that several of Ino's personal belongings were missing from the room, including her mobile phone. This detail shifted part of the investigation away from the room itself, because the removal of personal items suggested that someone had left the scene carrying objects that could be traced, sold, or used. Police began tracking the phone, and the signal eventually indicated a location in a narrow alley leading toward a small prayer house in the Kosumbi area of Tangerang. The officers moved into the area and approached a modest house where a teenage boy named Ramath Alam, commonly called Alam, lived. He was 15 years old at the time and was a second-year junior high school student. Alam was arrested at the house and brought in for questioning on suspicion of involvement in Ino's death. After several hours of interrogation, he admitted involvement and stated that there were two other people connected to the incident, Ramath Arifin, known as Arif, and Imam Hapriyati. Both Arif and Imam were 24 years old and worked as factory laborers. Arif worked at the same factory as Ino, while Imam worked at a pipe manufacturing factory. As the information emerged, the case quickly drew public attention and was taken over directly by the Polda Metro Jaya. Not long after the arrests, Senior Commissioner Paul Krishnamurti from Polda Metro Jaya gave a statement explaining that Alam, Imam, and Arif did not originally know each other, but they each had an interest in Ino. According to the police statement, the motive involved personal and emotional grievances connected to romantic interest. Investigators stated that jealousy, anger, and resentment had built up separately in each of the three individuals, and that these emotions eventually led them to cooperate in an act of violence against Ino. During questioning, the three suspects stated that they lost control of their emotions and carried out the assault and killing together. Imam told investigators that he had obtained Ino's phone number from friends and had sent messages to her multiple times, but never received a reply. He stated that he felt rejected and humiliated, and that he had believed her friendly behavior toward him meant something more than it did. Arif, during questioning, stated that he felt insulted by Ino because he believed she had mocked him with harsh words, and he said that those words stayed in his mind for a long time and built into resentment. Over time, Both men described feeling that they had been wronged, and when an opportunity appeared, they decided to act on that anger. On the 15th of May, 2016, police conducted a preliminary reconstruction with the three suspects present. Alam, Arif, and Imam were asked to demonstrate several of the actions that led to Eno's death. 3 days later, a full reconstruction was conducted in which the suspects demonstrated the sequence of events in more detail. From the suspect statements, the reconstruction, and the autopsy results, investigators assembled the sequence of events that began on the night of the 12th of May, 2016. That night, Eno was resting in her dormitory room after work when she received a phone call from Alam, who was her boyfriend at the time. During that phone call, Alam asked to meet her, but Eno refused. During the same conversation, she told him that she wanted to end the relationship and told him that her family had arranged for her to be matched with another man. This information appeared to have caused a strong emotional reaction. After the call ended, Alam went to Eno's dormitory room. When he arrived, he asked to meet her and requested a final embrace as a farewell. Eno allowed him to enter the room and agreed to meet him inside. Inside the room, the two of them were physically close, and after some time, Alam attempted to initiate sexual intercourse. Eno refused because she was afraid of becoming pregnant. According to Alam's statement, the refusal caused him to feel insulted and angry, and his emotions escalated quickly. He then forced himself on Eno despite her refusal. After the assault, Alam left the room, and according to later statements, he was still visibly angry when he walked away from the dormitory area, and he left Eno alone in the room at that time, still alive. Sometime after leaving the room, Alam encountered two men, Arif and Imam, who at that point were not familiar to him personally. One of them asked what he was doing in the area, and Alam answered that he had just been with someone named Inda. The name caused confusion, and they asked him to explain who Inda was and why he was in the dormitory area at that hour. During this conversation, it became clear that Inda was the name Alam used for Eno. After this realization, Alam brought Arif and Imam to Eno's room to show them directly. Inside the room, Eno admitted that she had used the name Inda when she first got to know Alam. This admission appears to have triggered a strong emotional reaction from both Arif and Imam, because both men had separately developed feelings for Eno. Up to that point, neither of them had been in a relationship with her, and both had experienced repeated rejection. According to later statements, Eno often avoided them, did not respond to their messages, and refused requests to meet. Imam had only known Eno for approximately 2 weeks, but he had already obtained her phone number from other factory workers and had been sending her messages regularly without receiving replies. He had also attempted to meet her in person near the mosque area, but she refused to meet him and did not respond in a way that encouraged further contact. Arif, who worked in the same factory as Eno, stated that he felt humiliated because he believed Eno had insulted him and mocked his appearance at work, and he stated that these insults stayed in his mind and gradually built into resentment. For a period of time, both men kept these feelings to themselves, but over time the resentment turned into anger and then into a more deliberate form of hostility. While the three men were inside the room with Eno, the situation changed quickly. According to the reconstruction and suspect statements, Imam suddenly pressed a pillow against Eno's face, causing her to panic and struggle. At the same time, Arif told Alam to find a sharp weapon in the kitchen area. Alam left the room and went to the kitchen area to search for a knife or similar object, but he was unable to find one, possibly because many workers kept their cooking utensils inside their own dormitory rooms rather than in a shared kitchen. While Alam was away from the room, Arif and Imam continued the assault. One of them held the pillow over Eno's face while also restraining her hands, and the other assaulted her. The reconstruction indicated that Eno attempted to resist and struggled during this period. After some time, they used a bedsheet to restrain and wrap her. The sequence of actions during this period was later matched with the injuries documented in the autopsy report, particularly injuries consistent with restraint, blunt force, and prolonged assault. Meanwhile, Alam continued searching in another area, and eventually found a hoe. He took the hoe and brought it back to Eno's room. When Alam returned to the room carrying the hoe, he appeared startled when he saw that Eno had already been wrapped in cloth. He checked her condition and realized that she was still breathing. At that point, Arif had already left the room, and only Imam remained inside with Alam and Eno. According to the later statements and reconstruction, instead of seeking help, Alam continued the assault. Imam lifted Eno's arms above her head to restrain her, while Alam assaulted her again. The assault escalated, and Alam used the hoe handle, forcing it into her body. The autopsy later confirmed that the internal injuries caused by this act were the primary cause of death. Imam later stated that he did not expect Alam to carry out that act, and claimed he was shocked when it happened. After this, both of them went to the bathroom to clean themselves, and then left Eno in the room. She was left on the bed with the hoe handle still inside her body, and the cloth still wrapped around her. After leaving the dormitory, Imam intended to leave the area, and did not take any items from the room. Alam, however, took Eno's mobile phone and kept it. He did not turn the phone off, which later allowed police to trace the device to his location. The 3 suspects were later brought to trial after the case file was completed. The Tangerang District Attorney's Office identified Alam as the primary perpetrator. On the 7th of June 2016, the trial began at the Tangerang District Court. The panel of judges was led by Chief Judge R. Asaharni, with Agus Kurniawan, R. Longa, and Putri Ganti serving as panel members. The session began at 10:30 in the morning. Eno's parents, Maputo and Arif Fikri, were present in court after being brought from Lebak Wangi. During the trial, the 3 defendants were charged under multiple articles of the Indonesian Criminal Code, including Article 338 and Article 340 related to murder and premeditated murder, which carried the possibility of life imprisonment or the death penalty. They were also charged under Article 339 related to murder associated with another crime, Article 354 related to aggravated assault, Article 365 related to violent theft, and Article 285 related to rape. Because Alam was still a minor, he did not receive the maximum sentence applicable to adults, and instead received a juvenile sentence calculated as 2/3 of the adult maximum penalty under applicable juvenile law at the time. During the court proceedings, Eno's mother was unable to remain in the courtroom and left while crying, and she was received by relatives outside the courtroom. Around the time of the trial, a community group from Banten held demonstrations demanding maximum punishment for all perpetrators. During one court session, Imam and Arif made a statement claiming that another person named Dimas was the actual perpetrator, describing him as a man with a mole on his face. This statement was later withdrawn. Arif eventually admitted that the story about Dimas was false and stated that he had been persuaded to give that statement after being promised legal assistance by Alam's parents if he helped reduce Alam's responsibility in the case. During that testimony, Arif appeared visibly emotional while explaining how the false statement had been arranged. During the trial, Arif cried when he was shown photographs documenting Eno's final condition. The photographs had been entered into evidence as part of the prosecution file, and they were shown again during testimony. Members of Eno's family were present in the courtroom and listened as each defendant gave their account, and with each statement, the emotional condition inside the courtroom became more difficult to contain. Testimony from the defendants often changed in detail, and the courtroom atmosphere became increasingly tense as the proceedings continued. It was understood by everyone present that the final decision would determine not only the legal outcome for the defendants, but also whether the victim's family felt that the process had delivered justice in proportion to what had happened. Alam and his legal counsel continued to present a defense stating that he was not the primary perpetrator and that he had been placed in a situation he could not control. The presiding judge later explained the considerations used in reaching the decision, stating that the actions committed against Eno were extremely violent and had caused deep psychological suffering for the victim's family. The judge also noted during sentencing that Alam had not shown clear remorse for his actions during the legal process. He was ultimately sentenced to 10 years in prison, a sentence issued under juvenile sentencing provisions because of his age at the time of the crime. The decision caused shock and sadness for Eno's family, who had hoped for a heavier sentence. On the other side, Alam's family stated that they would file an appeal. On the 20th of January, 2017, prosecutors formally read their sentencing demands for Arif and Imam, stating that both men had been proven legally and convincingly guilty of rape accompanied by premeditated murder. The prosecution demanded the death penalty, which was consistent with what the victim's family had requested. Before the verdict was delivered, both defendants were given the opportunity to present their defense statements. On the 1st of February, they requested leniency, stating that they had confessed and expressed regret. Their legal counsel argued that the death penalty was too severe and requested life imprisonment instead. In his statement, Imam said that he did not originally intend to kill Eno. Arif stated that he became involved because he felt pressured and influenced by Imam. These statements were considered by the court, but the panel of judges at the Tangerang District Court did not accept the argument for leniency. On the 8th of February, 2017, the court sentenced Arif and Imam to death. The judges stated that the killing had been carried out in a planned and deliberate manner, and that the level of violence involved left no basis for reducing the sentence. The court also stated that the crime had caused profound suffering for the victim's family and had shocked the public. After the verdict, members of Eno's family expressed gratitude for the decision, stating that they hoped the sentence would serve as a warning in future cases. The case file was then closed with the sentencing documents, forensic reports, reconstruction records, and trial transcripts forming the final archive of the case. And that brings all of the stories to an end. Thank you for spending this quiet part of the night with me. I know these stories can sometimes stay on your mind, so for now, you can let them go and simply return to the quiet around you. Take another slow breath, get comfortable, and let the night continue at its own pace. Good night, everyone. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time.